welcome back to another DSCC lab walkthrough. Today we'll be doing lab 4 DHCP configuration. Now today's tasks are to configure a DHCP scope and scope options, configure global options, and configure a reservation. Alright, so let's get started with task 1, which is configure a DHCP scope and scope option. The first thing we are going to do is add the DHCP role into our app server. So let's go ahead and install it just like we would with any other role. I have my DHCP server here. I'm going to select it, add features, click on next. Click on next. We're not installing any extra features. And let's go ahead and complete this installation. Alright, so our DHCP server role has finished installing. So now let's go ahead and complete the DHCP configuration. All we really need to do in this post-deployment configuration is authorize the server to be a DHCP server. So go ahead and click on that blue hyperlink for complete DHCP configuration. Click on next on this first description screen, and you should already have your credentials automatically populated. All you have to do is commit and click on close. Alright, so now that we finished our post-deployment configuration, we can head over to our DHCP server snap-in console and configure our scope. Let's open up our DHCP. Alright, so the first thing you see is our server, and then you see IPv4 and IPv6. Now we are not using IPv6, so we won't be focusing on any of that today. Now under IPv4 you see server options, policies, and filters, but you don't see any actual scope. So we are going to add a new scope by right-clicking on IPv4 and selecting new scope. Once the wizard pops up, you're going to click next, and then we are going to name our scope. So this one is going to be 11mu primary scope. This is the first DHCP server that we have running on our domain, so it'll be our primary. Now the description isn't necessary, but if you need to, you can go ahead and add that description. Now our start IP address is the first available IP that we will be able to assign using DHCP. And our end IP is the last one. So this is where we configure our range. Now I'm going to set my range to begin with 101. So I'm going to set 172.18.11.101. And for my end, I'm going to put 126. Now the length is going to be your subnet mask. I'm running a /25, so I'm going to change this length to a 25, and it'll automatically populate my subnet mask. Once you have your range configured, go ahead and click on next. Ensure that your subnet mask is the proper network. Now, if I had any exclusions or delay that I would like to add to that range, I would input that here. I do not have any at the time, so I'm going to go ahead and skip this page and click on next. Now, the lease duration is how long an IP address will be given to a device, and if it is not active after a certain amount of time, or even if it is, it will retrieve that IP address and reassign it. This helps us keep a proper management of our IPs, and we don't have anything out there floating around that isn't being used. So we're going to leave this as default. We have 8 or 7 days. Let's change it back to 8, and let's click on next. Now, do I want to configure some DHCP options? Go ahead and select yes, and we can get a few of those knocked out right now. Now, the first option that we have is our default gateway. Now, this is some extra information that your DHCP server would provide your client when they request an IP address from DHCP. This way you don't have to go around and configure extra things, right? You can configure the gateway, as we see right here, which will be .1, Click on next, and we can also configure the domain name and DNS server. So our parent domain name is automatically populated. All I have to do is input the actual IP. I'm going to remove this real quick so you can see what it looks like. I'm going to type in the server name, 11mu DC01. Now if I click resolve, it'll populate the IP. Let me delete the IP real quick so that you guys can see. All right, there it is, right? It resolves my IP address for my domain controller. So let's go ahead and click resolve, and let's click on add. And I've just added my DNS server. Now if I had a secondary, I would go ahead and add that on this screen as well. Right now I only have my primary set up, so that's all we're going to do for now. So once you have that information in there, click on next. Here you can input some information for a Win server if you are running one. We do not have one set up, so we're going to click on next as well. And then last but not least, we want to activate our scope now. Alright, so we've completed our scope configuration. Now we see that our scope has populated. We see a few more folders in there as well. We see address pool, where we can see our range. We have address leases, where we would be able to see anything that was active if we had anything pulling from DHCP. We could also see the reservations. We don't have anything set up right now. We can also see the scope options that we configured during when that wizard prompted us to, right? So we have our router, our DNS servers, and our DNS domain name. Okay, so let's jump into task 2. Now we already have most of our scope options configured, so during this step we're really only going to configure the only one that's left for our environment, which is our NTP server. So let's go ahead and right click on that and configure options. Now as you can see, we have multiple other options that we can configure through DHCP. Let's go ahead and scroll down to our NTP server. And our NTP server for this environment is going to be our domain controller. So let's add that IP and select apply. Alright, and there it is. It's populated under our scope options, and that's all there really is to configure in our NTP server options. Now for task 3, all we have left is to configure a reservation for one of our devices. So let's navigate over to our reservations folder under our scope. As you can see, we don't have any reservations, so let's change that by right clicking on the folder and selecting new reservation. Now this is going to be for our workstation, so we're simply going to name this 11mu workstation 01. It's the name of our workstation. Here I'm going to set the IP that I want this device to have, and then the last thing I need is the actual MAC address of this device, which is its unique identifier. So I'm going to log in real quick into my workstation to retrieve this information. Now once I log in, I'm going to open up my command prompt, and I'm going to run an ipconfig all command. Now what I'm looking for here is the Ethernet adapter, or whatever that adapter is that I am using to connect to my network. Now this is what I'm using right now, and here we can see our physical address, which is our MAC address. So I want to copy this information so that I can use this during my DHCP configuration. So let me open up a notepad real quick. I'll type this up. 005056 Bravo Echo 6761. Okay, I'll put this to the side for now, and let's navigate back to our app server where we are hosting DHCP, and let's add this MAC address to the reservation configuration. Now, a description isn't needed, but it's definitely useful when it comes to management and just knowing what this device or why this device has a reservation. All right, we'll close this out, and now we see that we have a reservation under the reservations folder, and we can also see the options that it will be receiving. So now let's head back into our workstation and change or ensure that our device is running or configured and set up to pull from DHCP and not a static address. Okay, so I'm logged into my device. Let's head over to our network and internet settings so that we can verify our adapter settings. And of course, we're going to change our IPv4. Looks like we already have this set up for DHCP. Let's close that out. Now, most devices by default have DHCP enabled. Now let's open up a command prompt, type in ipconfig and release. So, all right, now we can see that we don't have anything configured on our Ethernet adapter. So now let's run an ipconfig/renew command. And this is going to reach out to the DHCP server if there is one on your network and retrieve its information. All right, so we can see that our IP populated just like we wanted it to. And if I type in ipconfig all, I can also see my DHCP server from which this device is pulling that information from. And I can also see the following information or scope options that I also configure, such as my DNS server. And in my app server, where I have DHCP set up, I can verify that by seeing the address list of the device that I just pulled that information for.